so we might get a start. But thanks for your welcome. And the topic of the talk is on Catholic social teaching, and in particular cooperatives and cryptocurrencies, and how all of those come together in the wonderful world of economic justice. So let's start off with a reflection on the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 12, verses 13 to 17. Then they sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see." And they brought one, and then he said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "The emperor's." Jesus said to them, "Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed at him. Give to the emperor the things that are the
Sorry, everyone. I think Father Thomas has some technical difficulties. Might just wait a minute.
What about now?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, sorry everyone.
That's okay. You're going to give to the emperor.
Okay, so give to the emperor what belongs to the emperor, and to God what belongs to God. And traditionally, this has been seen as justifying the division between church and state that we have in our social teaching, that there are domains in economics and justice which the church speaks upon, as it were, as being the voice of conscience, the mouthpiece of what we call the natural law. And the church is able to speak upon these matters, but these are, properly speaking, matters that don't rely upon our belief in the Bible to justify the teachings of the church in socio-economic matters. So if we look at the way our society has progressed since the time of our Lord, we know that early on the society at that time was very much an agrarian society. People made their living from the land, and that was pretty much the case for most of the first millennia. However, around the time of the Middle Ages, we began to see people migrating more and more into the cities. And around this time, we had the opening up of the spice routes to the Far East. So people discovered that they could make a living, not simply by farming and tilling the land, but they could make a living by buying and selling. And so they would import products, much as we do now, from the Far East, and people began to make a living by selling these products. And so here we had the rise of the merchants, because many of the great things we have in the West, many of the great inventions, the foods that we have were imported from the Far East, and I like to say that they came through the Middle East, and the Middle East took about 20% cut, and they continued on to their merry way to Europe. So around the time of the Middle Ages, the time of St. Francis, St. Dominic, we had a migration into these medieval cities, and that continued well on into the second millennia, up until the time just before the Industrial Revolution. So around this time, just before the Industrial Revolution, people were living in townships, were still living in farms, and what they would do is they would effectively work from home. So producers would send off their textiles, their raw materials to people in their own homes, and people would manufacture, would produce textiles, clothing, shoes in their own homes, and then they would send them off the finished product back to the producers to sell at market. So this system is known as the putting out system, and that was in place in England just before the Industrial Revolution. So people were still at that time working from home. However, producers discovered that they could gain greater efficiencies when people came together to work, when people would come together in factories, in warehouses, and so around this time, we had the development of these large-scale factories, the first production lines, and this was the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And this dominated the way of life of the West ever since, and we still see the effects of the Industrial Revolution even now, with these large-scale production lines. Most of them are now, a lot of them are now heavily automated, but the beginnings of these large-scale factories and production lines go back to the Industrial Revolution. However, around this time, they began to develop some social problems associated with people moving into these cities and townships, and the working conditions were pretty lax, pretty poor. They even employed children who can get into the tiny parts of machinery. And so working conditions were pretty dire at that time. And a young man in London at the time noticed these poor working conditions, and he began to rail against them. And his name was Karl Marx. And so he argued that that we need a better way. We need to protect the rights of workers. And in his eyes, there's always going to be this division between workers and the producers, the employees. There's always going to be this class struggle. And the only way to unshackle yourself from the burdens of these capitalists, from these employers, is by coming together, by protesting for your workers' rights, and eventually by gaining power in government, so as to do away not only with factories, not only with the wealth of employers, but in fact all wealth, get rid of private property. And so they advocated for a communist system whereby the state would own property and distribute to each according to their need. And so we had this this tussle between, on the one hand, free market capitalism, and on the other, socialism, communism, which emphasized the role of the state over and against the freedom of the individual. And so into this tussle came Pope Leo XIII with his great encyclical Rerum Novarum. And that was probably the first official church pronunciation focusing specifically on socio-economic matters more directly. And he basically tried to articulate a middle road between laissez-faire free market capitalism on the one hand and the various forms of socialism on the other. Now I do have a PowerPoint which I might share. Is everyone able to see that? Okay, so we're looking at around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and we know that there is this tussle between the free market capitalists on the one hand and Karl Marx and his communist mates on the other, and into the breach stepped Pope Leo XIII with his encyclical, his famous encyclical Rerum Novarum on new things, where he basically tried to articulate a halfway course, a middle way between capitalism and communism. And in this encyclical, he emphasized the rights of workers to fair working conditions, the rights of workers to be able to come together into associations, what eventually came to be known as trade unions, and to advocate for fair working conditions. So all of that is good, but he said that we still need private property. On the other hand, you can't just completely abolish private enterprise and private property, because if you do, then the impact of that will be that people won't identify with the fruits of their labors. And we see this at the moment. If you look at communist China, they're going through a property bubble about to burst at the moment. And in China, part of the reason for that is because there was a huge explosion in property investment, basically because in China, people don't trust the stock market to invest their property. They invested their hard-earned wealth in land. However, being a communist country, they don't own the land, and so they have no incentive to think long-term, more than a few decades. And so you had these proliferation of apartment buildings as investment properties, and they weren't built to last. They were only built to last for probably a few decades, because people don't own the land upon which those apartments, those houses are built. And this is the problem with abolishing private property. And I see this firsthand in religious life, where we don't have private property. And unless you assign something to an individual, it invariably doesn't get done. People need to identify with the fruits of their labors. And this is why private property is an essential part of our society and economy. And so Leo XIII emphasized this in his encyclical. And so following the publication of this seminal encyclical on Catholic social teaching, we have some Catholic thinkers, philosophers, theologians, both lay and religious, who came and developed an economic model which tried to build on the contributions of Leo XIII, and they built various models which sought to arrive at a midway point between communism and capitalism. One of these models is known as Distributism, and this was formulated by G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc in England in the late 19th, early part of the 20th century. And some of the features of this economic model is first of all, the need for everyone to own the fruit of their labors. So they emphasize the importance of private property. They put that under the expression 3 acres and a cow. Everyone should have 3 acres of land and a cow. Today we'll probably say everyone should own their own home and perhaps have a laptop and a smartphone. But the point of it was that everyone needs to own the fruits of their labors to be able to identify with the work that they engage in, because work is not simply meant to be a laborious exercise which we do begrudgingly simply to earn an income, but it's something meant to raise us up and really be an expression of the fullness of our talents and our humanity. And so in this distributist model, we have as much ownership of the means of production as possible. So rather than ownership being concentrated in the hands of a few, rather than wealth being concentrated in the bank accounts of a few, we need to distribute the wealth of our economy to as many people as possible. And so how do you do this? Well, one way they looked at was to focus wealth on small enterprises. So they emphasize the importance of small scale shops and businesses, and also cooperative enterprises, whereby if you're going to have large corporations, large companies to take advantage of the economies of scale that come with large organizations, yes, you can have that. But the ideal would be where the workers of that large organization, that company, are also the owners, what we refer to as a cooperative model of economic enterprise. And I'll talk about the largest cooperative in the world shortly. So that's distributism. Over in Germany, a German Jesuit by the name of Heinrich Pesch, he also saw what was happening in Britain. He also studied the works of Karl Marx, and he too tried to arrive at a midway point between communism and capitalism. And his model was known as solidarism. So the emphasis on solidarity, that rather than there being a tussle, a class struggle between employers and workers, between the owners of the means of production and the employees, the workers, in place of this class struggle, he emphasized the need of cooperation. That on the one hand, we reject a rampant individualism, which emphasizes the freedom of the individual, and rejects any notion of obligation to the community, to family, to society. So on the one hand, it rejects that Margaret Thatcher style of libertarianism, whereby there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. But on the other hand, he sought to uphold the importance of society, of private property. And so he emphasized the importance of workers being able to come together, not just in the way of trade unions to represent their own interests, but rather entire industries, employers, employees, coming together into these industry groups to represent the interests of all. And so rather than this adversarial approach between employers and employees, they should all come together and work together to arrive at equitable outcomes. And so he advocated the importance of these industry groups. So his ideas were instrumental in the second great social encyclical, Quadragesimo Anno, the 40th year following Rerum Novarum, published by Pius XI. In this encyclical, Pius XI, he discusses the importance of the ethical implications of the social and economic order. He described the major dangers for human freedom arising from unfettered capitalism, on the one hand, but also totalitarian communism, which denies the rights of the individual on the other. And so he called for a reconstruction of the social order based upon these two principles of solidarity and subsidiarity. And those are the two main words of our talk today: the importance of solidarity and subsidiarity. So if you take on board all of these contributions by the popes and the philosophers and the theologians, we can arrive at the four great principles of Catholic social teaching: the dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, as I mentioned, and also solidarity. That the fundamental core of our social teaching is the inherent dignity of each individual person, and that can't be negated by any government, because before you have any government, you have the individual, and the individual comes together and realizes that we're all incomplete as individuals. I can do some things you can't, and you can do some things I can't. And so we need to come together as a family, as a community, and pull together our resources for the common good. And the way we do that is in a cooperative manner, solidarity, but also in a manner which doesn't focus or centralize too much wealth or authority in the hands of a few individuals, corporations, or government. And that, of course, is the problem we face at the moment, whether you talk about the Western capitalism, on the other hand, where wealth is focused in the hands of a few. You know, you look at the Jeff Bezos of the world. But on the other hand, if you go into the East, the communist countries, most particularly communist China, where all authority and most wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few Communist Party government members. And so we need to arrive at a midway point between these two extremes. And so here we have the models of solidarity and subsidiarity. So how do we implement these models concretely here and now in our modern economy? Well, I'd like to talk about the importance of subsidiarity. In that second encyclical by Pope Pius XI, he refers to subsidiarity as the principle that one should not withdraw from individuals and commit to the community what they can accomplish by their own enterprise and industry. So basically, if you're able to distribute wealth as widely as possible, if you're able to devolve authority to the local levels as much as possible, that would be more conducive to the health of those communities, because it means that those communities have ownership over the fruits of their labors, and they also have a stake in the decision making for their own their own economy, their own communities, their own lives. So this is why the principle of subsidiarity is so important. That you don't want to concentrate the wealth and the power, the decision-making authority in the hands of a few corporations or governments. G.K. Chesterton said that the problem with capitalism is not that there are too many capitalists, but there are too few capitalists. We need more people owning wealth, and we need those people having the capacity to make decisions for their own workplaces, their own lives. And one way to do that, as I mentioned earlier, is through cooperatives. A cooperative is simply an organization where the owners of that organization are the workers, if you're talking about worker cooperatives, or the customers, if you're talking about customer cooperatives, such as the co-op bookshop. I remember in my first year at university signing up to the co-op bookshop at Sydney University, becoming a member of the co-op and receiving discounts. So effectively I became a part owner of the co-op, and so the profits are distributed in the way of discounts to members. So when we talk about worker cooperatives, we have a situation where the workers are the owners of the organization. There is no distinction between shareholders and workers as you do in the current limited liability corporation. And so that means that workers have a stake in the organization. They identify with that organization, and the wealth of that organization is distributed to those workers, and they also have a voice in terms of the decision-making processes of that cooperative. And the largest cooperative in the world is known as the Mondragon Corporation, that was founded in the north of Spain, in the Basque region, back in 1956 by a very young Spanish priest. He's got a very long surname, which I won't pronounce. I'll just call him Father Ari. And so he arrived at this small parish in the north of Spain as a very young parish priest in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, where there were huge inequalities in Spanish society. Many people were doing it tough. And very few people were willing to commit to invest in that particular region in the north of Spain. And so he tried to implement some of these teachings, some of these principles that we've been referring to, by bringing together a group of young people in the parish. He selected 5 young people in the parish, and they came together and they set up the very first cooperative, known as Fago Electrodomesticos, producing white goods. And that was founded back in 1955, eventually establishing the cooperative in 1956. And ever since then, it's grown to be the largest cooperative in the world, the largest Spanish, 7th largest Spanish company, employing over 80,000 people. And each of these people is a part owner of the organization. They pay into the organization once they become employees, and each year they're allocated a portion of the profits of that organization. However, they're not allowed to spend those profits immediately, but rather they're invested on their behalf. And there's a real sense of community in that organization, such that during the global financial crisis back in 2008, they did not let go of any employees. They all took a bit of a haircut, so some reduction in income. However, they were able to hold on to all of their employees because they identified with each and every one of them as members of the community. In that organization, the wages are regulated so that the general manager, for example, would earn no more than 5 times as much as the minimum wage of the lowest employee in that cooperative. So we have relative equity there in terms of pay. So you don't have these outrageous differences that we see in companies such as Qantas, where the CEO earns hundreds of times more than the baggage handlers. So we have a certain degree of equity there, and just a general sense of community, which you don't see in a public corporation where you have the managers, the executives, the shareholders, and the employees always engaged in this tussle to further their own interests. Unfortunately, the current model that we rely on in terms of our Western economy is still very much that public corporation where there is a distinction between employees, employers, executives, and managers, and you see the effects of that, most especially when there is a crisis. So the last great economic crisis we had was the global financial crisis back in 2008, whereby you had these investment banks basically playing with the lives of individual landowners by coming up with these very intricate financial instruments in order to further their own economic interests. When this property bubble eventually collapsed, the government was forced to bail out these huge banks, which they should have been allowed to collapse. A few of them did collapse. However, the larger ones were allowed to survive. And ever since then, the problem has actually only gotten worse, because rather than the problem being resolved, you had a situation where the governments have taken on this debt that was incurred by these financial institutions. And now that we've got another crisis on our hands in the way of the pandemic, governments have been forced to print trillions and trillions of dollars in order to help people out during this time of lockdown. But the problem with that is, if you print enough money, you devalue the wealth of everyone, because it means that there's a greater amount of money in the world looking out for the same number of goods. And so you have a situation there where over the next 20 or 30 years, we're probably likely to see inflation skyrocket. We're already seeing that in the stock market in terms of land prices, fuel prices now. And so that is effectively a government tax on the wealth of the individual to bail out the banks, the wealthy few. And we know that their wealth is continuing to increase. However, the wealth of the individual is actually going backwards in terms of real dollar value. So the writing is on the wall in terms of our current system. And so this is where I can talk a little bit about cryptocurrencies, which is a new emerging form of asset ownership. Now, back in 2008, or shortly after, when the governments printed so much money in order to bail out these bankers, a white paper, a journal article, was produced by a fellow called Satoshi Nakamoto, and he devised a peer-to-peer cash system whereby you would have a currency which would not be backed by any individual corporation or government, but it would be completely decentralized. Why do I talk about that in the context of Catholic social teaching? Well, if you go back to that principle of subsidiarity, that the more we can decentralize wealth and power, the better. And some see cryptocurrencies as a way of decentralizing the wealth from the hands of governments and a few to more and more people. It's still very much in its infancy, and I mean there are always going to be teething problems with new currencies. However, the principles underlying cryptocurrencies in terms of security, scalability, and decentralization, they align well with the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity that I spoke about. In particular, decentralization aligns well with subsidiarity, that the wealth is not controlled by large governments or large banks. If you look at what's happening at the moment in Lebanon, where a few of us are from, unfortunately, many people are being locked out of their own wealth by the big banks. And so many people simply don't trust the government, who, because of corruption, have siphoned millions of dollars out of the country. They also don't trust their own banks because they can lock them out of their own accounts or limit their withdrawals. So people have nowhere to go apart from their own mattress. And so we need a better way to store our wealth, and also to ensure that the rights of the individual are not taken advantage of by the wealthy, by the political class, by governments. And some see blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies, as a way to do that, in particular through the decentralized nature of these currencies, which are transparent. They're on the blockchain. The movements of these currencies can be seen, and they're not controlled by any particular government or individual, and so they can't be manipulated as our fiat currencies, as even gold or silver is being devalued and manipulated at the moment. So that's all I've got for you today. Basically, what I'd like to take away from this particular presentation is the importance of you as an individual having the rights over your own labor and your own wealth, that you shouldn't be beholden to big government or large corporations to determine what you do with your own wealth and the fruits of your labors. I'm happy to open up to any questions you might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Father Thomas. Does anyone have any questions for Father Thomas? Nope.
I've got a bit of one.
Yep, Father Laurie.
All my financial expertise comes from watching the 7 o'clock news. But one thing I have noticed, that the Bitcoin, it can be hard to predict just exactly how much money you have, because it seems to go right up sky high and then next day right down, which possibly comes because it's not backed by any particular government or big bank. But what are your observations?
I suppose if in doubt, zoom out. Look at the long-term appreciation of value. That yes, it is volatile from year to year, and that's partly got to do with the way it's been set up. Every 4 years, there's a halving of Bitcoin, which does have an impact upon the value of each individual Bitcoin. But just as the discovery of new gold, would have an impact upon the value of gold in the world. If we suddenly discover a planet full of gold, then the value of gold would be devalued because there'd be so much more of it. So yes, there is volatility because of manipulation, and there's always going to be manipulation to a certain extent when you have individual organizations or exchanges playing around with the short-term value of any particular stock or fiat currency or cryptocurrency. So that's why I say, if in doubt, always zoom out and look at the long-term picture. And what you see there is that the percentage return has outweighed any other form of investment, including physical gold. So just as with anything, think long-term when it comes to investing. If you focus on the short-term volatility, then you go into trading, which is really not investing. So investing, always think long-term, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the track, and invariably the price, the value appreciates over that time.
Do you think that, well, what do you think it would have as advantage or disadvantage for raising the poor a little bit higher up in the financial status?
It's interesting. If you look at the number one country in terms of cryptocurrency transactions, you would think it might be, be the US, but it's actually Nigeria. Not because of these Nigerian princes running around trying to take your hard-earned money, but simply because people in the third world have been locked out of most of the wealth of the world simply because they do not have access to the banking system of the world. And so they have no way of storing their wealth, let alone investing their wealth in a safe way. And so this new emerging class of cryptocurrencies represents a way for people in the third world to invest their money in a way that won't be confiscated or manipulated by corrupt governments, which you find in many of those developing countries. And if you look at what's happening in El Salvador, which has become the first country to officially recognize Bitcoin as legal tender, the reason why they did that is because, number one, they don't have their own currency. They rely upon the US dollar. However, in order for El Salvadorians to send US dollars from wherever they are in the world working back to their families, they have to go through companies such as Western Union, who charge huge fees simply to send money back home to their families. So this new technology represents a way where people who have been locked out of the banking system can access new ways of storing their wealth, of investing their wealth, and of transferring their wealth, in a way that's extremely efficient, quick, and very cost effective.